So I'd like to begin this evening with some questions. And if you have a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil, you might just want to jot down your answer as I go through 7 questions with you. The first question is, you can answer, am I speaking of Pope Francis or Francis of Assisi? And the first question is, this Francis met with the leading Muslim leader of his day. Francis of Assisi or Francis of Rome? Question number 2. This Francis's emphasis on mercy, humility, and simplicity are essential and well-known characters of his life. Thirdly, he responded to a call to repair the church. This one, his joy was or is contagious, bringing a new light and hope to the world. This Francis authored a text which begins, Laudato si, mi Signore, praise be you, my Lord. And this Francis has as priorities the poor, the planet, and peace. And lastly, this Francis preaches the gospel at all times, using words when necessary. Well, yes, I think you're all going to get an A+ or 100%. The similarities between Francis of Rome and Francis of Assisi are many. They are striking, and they bring a new refreshment and hope to our church and to our world. So what a delight for me to spend some time with you reflecting on the powerful and challenging message proclaimed to us by St. Francis and Pope Francis, an urgent and most timely message. Perhaps it would be good to begin on the very first day of Pope Francis's presentation to the world. Remember that balcony in St. Peter's Square? We have a pope. We have a pope, and his name will be Francis. People thought, oh, this is this Jesuit. The Francis must be Francis Xavier. And Pope Francis presented himself and said, his name is taken from the little poor man of Assisi, the man of peace. 3 days after his announcement was made, Pope Francis spoke to some 5,000 media representatives, and he said, after the conclusion of the voting, when I knew it was me, Cardinal Humes hugged and kissed me and said, don't forget the poor. So I chose the name Francis of Assisi, the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects the planet. How I would like a church that is poor and for the poor. That's the end of Francis's quote. By taking the name Francis, a name never before taken, our new Pope sent out a clear signal that this was not going to be a typical pontificate. For 800 years, no one had taken that name. Something was changing. We could spend hours reflecting on the similarities between Pope Francis and the mendicant friar from Assisi. First of all, one of the unknown priorities of St. Francis is his unequivocal emphasis on mercy. Each of his brothers was exhorted to be merciful, to always be merciful without exception. Francis didn't tell his brothers what to do or how to live. He expected them to listen to the Spirit for that direction. But one of the things he insisted on was that they always be merciful without exception. And we can talk about that further if you wish. But believe me when I say mercy was an essential element of the life, the spirituality of Francis. Why? Because God is merciful. And that mercy is what brings forgiveness, reconciliation, oneness, and peace to our world. That's the nature of God. Early in his papacy, after just 2 years, Pope Francis called for an extraordinary Jubilee year of mercy, calling the whole world to reflect on this characteristic of God. In his book, The Name of God is Mercy, is a must-read. Check it out. In that same year, 2015, Pope Francis issued the encyclical Laudato Si, based on the well-known prayer of St. Francis's, the Canticle of the Sun, or the Canticle of the Creatures. This song is well known, this poem is well known, and it has many sung versions. All creatures of our God and King, or the heavens are telling the glory of God. Many versions of that famous prayer to God. And it's Francis at his deepest spirituality. It was written right at the end of his life when everything for him was coming together into a unified understanding of God's oneness and goodness, presence in the world, and the goodness and the oneness that was meant to be for all the world, if we cooperate. All of that is celebrated in that wonderful prayer, the Canticle of Creation. Pope Francis's text, Laudato Si, is subtitled On Care for Our Common Home. And he invites every person on the planet, not just Christians, into the conversation about the needs of our planet and the conversion each person is called to in order to keep our precious home from being destroyed. His writing, rooted in the best scientific research, is a call to action for each one of us. His opening paragraph states, "In this canticle, St. Francis of Assisi reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life, and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us." He then speaks of how Mother Earth needs our help to keep from destroying her. What a crucial priority for all humanity to address together. His encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home is certainly a must-read. And today, as many of you probably know, September 1st, is the beginning of the season of creation. Several years ago, Pope Francis called us to observe this season of focusing on our sister Mother Earth and care for her. It begins today and it ends on October 4th, the feast day of St. Francis. And in May of this year, he released a 7-year action plan to implement Laudato Si. And both the encyclical and the action plan are available on the internet if you haven't discovered them yet. So check them out and let's get busy. In 2020, Francis released another encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, Brothers, Sisters, All. And just as Laudato Si calls us to examine our relationship with Mother Earth and all of creation, Fratelli Tutti invites and challenges us to examine our relationship with the entire human family. Pope Francis writes, quote, "The saint of fraternal love, simplicity, and joy, who inspired me to write the encyclical Laudato Si, prompts me once more to devote this new encyclical to fraternity and social friendship. Francis felt himself a brother to the sun, the sea, and the wind, yet he knew that he was even closer, more deeply united to those of his own flesh. Wherever he went, he sowed seeds of peace, walked alongside the poor, the abandoned, the infirm, and the outcast, the least of his brothers and sisters." Guess what my third recommendation for your reading is? Yep, Fratelli Tutti. And this is the writing that I'm going to focus on for the rest of my time with you. Knowing ourselves as brothers and sisters to all is truly the only way to bring about peace in our world. I feel that, true to the ways of St. Francis, Pope Francis actually best proclaims his message, brothers and sisters all, not through his words, but through his actions. Who can forget the Pope's embrace and kissing of the man with neurofibromatosis, commonly connected with the image of the elephant man, or of his foot washing of Muslim, Hindu, and Christian refugees, and the list of his actions of putting the gospel into action goes on and on. Let's consider again his namesake, St. Francis, his inspiration for Fratelli Tutti. It may be helpful to recall that the early dream of young Francis of Assisi to become a knight and fight in the Crusades changed drastically as he embraced the life of an itinerant preacher of gospel peace and penance. Peace and penance was his vocation in a nutshell. It was Francis's encounter with a leper early in his conversion that opened his eyes and allowed him to see as God sees, radically changing his ways of thinking and acting. Rather than seeing the leper as a repulsive menace to be avoided, as the people of his time did, by the grace of God, he saw a brother, a sister, to be loved and served. And thus was born Francis's vision of universal kinship, that everyone is brother, sister to the other. There are no exceptions. This vision of universal kinship eventually took Francis to encounter the Muslims and their leader, Sultan Malek al-Kamil. Although an undertold story for centuries, the story of the encounter between Francis and the Sultan is now being used to help build new understandings, new bridges and friendships, particularly with those who are deemed the other. This is a whole presentation on its own, as you might imagine. For our purposes, suffice it to say that in the year 1219, Francis traveled to the Levant on a crusader ship, and during a truce between the two armies, after a devastating, terrible battle and defeat of the Christians, the papal leader of the crusade reluctantly approved Francis's desire and request to enter into the Sultan's camp. Once there, we know that Francis and the Sultan conversed for several days, perhaps as long as 3 weeks, which was the length of the truce. Francis was obviously impressed by what he experienced among the Muslims. His writings and actions upon his return to Assisi testify to this. He never talked about it specifically, never, ever. But the words, the phrases, the suggestions he offered tell us that he was deeply impacted by what he experienced among the Muslims, including the way that they pray. What we know is that the encounter between Francis and Malek al-Kamil was respectful of each other and their religion, and that each truly listened to and learned from the other. There was a respectful openness to the other. Now, let's move from the 13th century to the 21st. Think of February of 2019, 800 years after St. Francis crossed the sea to visit the Sultan of Egypt. Another Francis traveled by plane to become the first pope ever to visit the Arabian Peninsula, the heartland of the Muslim world. Pope Francis accepted the invitation of Muslim leaders to attend an international meeting on human fraternity in Abu Dhabi. The goal of the meeting was to engage with Muslim leaders for the purposes of building peace and counteracting extremism. Think of what Francis of Assisi dealt with in his world. He wanted to build peace and counteract extremism on both sides. As he had done throughout his papacy, Francis addressed his Muslim hosts as brothers, calling the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar Mosque, Sheikh al-Tayyib, likely the most prominent Sunni Muslim in the world, my friend, my brother. This encounter in Abu Dhabi was the 5th time these two men of God had met. They issued a joint document at that time on human fraternity, acknowledging the significance of this opportunity to advance interreligious dialogue and mutual understanding between the followers of both religions and all religions in the year that marked the 800th anniversary of the historic meeting between Francis of Assisi and Sultan Malek al-Kamil. The document on human fraternity is a guide for advancing a culture of mutual respect. That statement became the basis for establishing the Higher Committee of Human Fraternity, which fosters a culture of dialogue and encounter. And if you want to read about some powerful efforts toward building a world of peace, Google the Higher Committee on Human Fraternity and see what they have been up to during the years since 2019. Upon his return to Rome, Pope Francis revealed that he was committed to writing his next encyclical on the same topic, human fraternity. In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis testifies that the demeanor of Francis and the Sultan, quote, not waging a war of words with each other aimed at imposing doctrines, but simply spreading the love of God, inspired this vision of a radically transformed society. It was needed at the time of Francis. It's desperately needed now. Pope Francis states simply, Francis of Assisi has inspired these pages. And I dare say, so has Sultan al-Kamil. For one does not dialogue, nor be a brother alone. Francis recognizes, quote, Imam al-Tayyib, with whom I met in Abu Dhabi, where we declared that God has created all human beings equal in rights, duties, and dignity, and has called them to live together as brothers and sisters. The encyclical continues, this action in Abu Dhabi was no mere diplomatic gesture, but a reflection born of serious dialogue and common commitment. They were both committed to bringing peace and understanding into our world at a whole new level. The present encyclical takes up and develops some of the great themes raised in the document that we both signed. So the encyclical Fratelli Tutti is really a deepening and an extension of the original draft of the human fraternity document. One commentary says that it's as though the encyclical was the work of 4 hands rather than 2. I cannot stress enough that Fratelli Tutti is something to do and to be, not just to read. Pope Francis says, I offer this encyclical in the hope that, in the face of present-day attempts to eliminate or ignore others, we may prove capable of responding with a new vision of fraternity and social friendship that will not remain at the level of words. End quote. A new kind of world is needed, drastically needed. There are many with this hope, this dream. Thousands of them are at our borders, at borders around the world. In March, Pope Francis again stunned the world by making his first international trip in over 15 months. The pandemic had hit. It kept him home. In the midst of a global pandemic, he took his message of peace and universal kinship to the people of Iraq and to the people of the world. One reporter called Francis's sojourn an absolutely beautiful and important example of nonviolence in action. After being met at the airport by the Prime Minister of Iraq, and children and dignitaries and all kinds of pomp and circumstance to welcome him, including dances, Francis was elated at such a reception. So were the children who did the dancing, I'm sure. All the people seemed delighted to welcome this pilgrim of peace to their country. Then he was hosted by President Salih at the presidential palace, where he spoke to a gathering of 150 politicians, civil servants, and diplomats. Francis said he had come to Iraq as a pilgrim of peace in search of fraternity. A pilgrim of peace. Remember, the vocation of Francis of Assisi was to preach peace and penance, to ask for forgiveness. And Pope Francis says, I come as a pilgrim of peace in search of fraternity. He also said he came as a penitent to beg heavenly forgiveness, mercy, for the destruction and the cruelty the country had experienced in the years since 2003. Each of the 6 cities he visited was decked out with welcome banners and signs of appreciation and love for this man of God who came to promote peace for the entire world. 90-year-old Ayatollah Sistani is widely recognized as Shia Islam's most influential leader. He's extremely reclusive and rarely grants meetings, but he made an exception to host Pope Francis. The Shia Muslim leader, al-Sistani, delivered a powerful message of peaceful coexistence, urging Muslims to embrace Iraq's long beleaguered Christian minority. The Ayatollah said, the religious authorities have a role in protecting the Christians, and that Christians should be able to live in peace and security with their full constitutional rights. He was very clear about that. Pope Francis thanked al-Sistani for having raised his voice in defense of the weakest and most persecuted during some of the most violent times in Iraq's recent history. In ancient Ur, the birthplace of Abraham, the Pope urged peace among the monotheistic faiths. Muslims, Christians, and Jews gathered to celebrate with Francis the beauty of that place. Francis said, this is true religiosity, to worship God and to love our neighbor. That's what religion is all about. Worship God and love our neighbor. He said to the faith leaders, it was fitting that they come together in Ur, quote, back to our origins, to the source of God's work, to the birth of our religions, not just the Christian religion, not just the Jewish religion, not just the Muslim religion, all of our religions. It is appropriate to pray together for peace as children of Abraham, the prophet common to Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And of course, Francis visited the Christians in Iraq. In 2003, it was estimated that there were 1.4 million Christians living in Iraq. Today, there are about 250,000. Francis offered support for their sacrifices in the midst of unimaginable suffering, and he urged them to continue to witness to their faith in Christ, especially by forgiving, showing mercy, and begged them to stay in the holy place, not to abandon that holy ground. He blessed them and their churches, and he brought a new hope and a new resolve to the people. Fratelli Tutti asks each one of us to accept our original identity, to be brother or sister to all, no exceptions. Francis of Assisi and El Camel, Pope Francis and Imam al-Tayyib, and Pope Francis and Ayatollah al-Sistani are making their faith-filled responses to show what it means to be brother to each other and to be sister to all. What will we do? Pope Francis obviously wants to make peace with all people, and the Taliban are our brothers and sisters. I cannot tell you the kind of hatred that existed between the Muslims and the Christians at the time of Francis. Christians wouldn't even call the Muslims people. Many really believed they were subhuman creatures. They didn't have a dignity that belongs to every one of us humans made in the image and likeness of God. They were referred to as beasts. Now, many Muslims believe the same thing about the Christians. It's the way the worldview was at the time. Don't we find a similar situation today with the Taliban, and now we're finding out even worse than the Taliban, ISIS-K and the Al-Qaeda and the other extremists. That's why Pope Francis repeatedly uses the word extremists. But the thing that we have to do is to believe that God is alive in each one of those. We can't doubt that. Our faith does not allow us to doubt that. More bombs is not going to bring about that kind of a change. We know that. Dialogue, understanding has got to be the way. Francis said, the only person who can really be the director or the leader of my group of friars, he didn't want to start a group, but that's what happened. People were attracted to his messages of peace and of change of behavior or conversion, metanoia. They were very much attracted to that. But he said, the real leader of our group is the Holy Spirit. And it's up to each one of us to listen to the Spirit and then do what the Spirit does. But we have to talk about what we're hearing from the Spirit to keep each other honest. And that, we need to do more of those kinds of conversations with each other too, so that we don't get ourselves off the edge. And we can have conversations that will lead us to deeper truth and to light and to joy and to peace in the world, yeah. I truly believe that the Spirit of God calls each of us to a deeper truth, to a greater communion with God and with our brothers and sisters, no exception, and with all creation. The lives and the words of both Francises proclaim that very message. Do we hear it? Do we see it? What do you hear? And what now would you like to share or ask?